The wind cut through the empty parking lot like a blade, howling between the buildings as snow swirled in frantic spirals. Logan pulled his coat tighter around himself, his breath fogging in the frigid air. It was too late to still be out, but he had worked overtime at the hardware store, and now all he wanted was to get home and collapse onto his couch with a hot meal. As he turned the corner behind the grocery store, he nearly missed it. A shadow, low to the ground, moving near the dumpsters. At first, he thought it was just a stray cat, but then he caught the shape bigger, leaner, a dog. Logan stopped in his tracks. The animal was rummaging through a torn trash bag, its ribs jutting out beneath a thick coat of matted fur. A German shepherd, or at least close to one. It was filthy, its once proud frame reduced to a trembling, desperate thing. Logan could hear the soft rustling as it sniffed through plastic wrappers, searching for anything edible. The sight made something twist in his chest. He had seen stray dogs before, but this one looked like it had been through hell. He took a slow step forward. The dog's head snapped up, ears flattening, body tensing. Its dark eyes locked onto his, wide and wary. "Hey, buddy," Logan said gently, keeping his voice low. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The dog didn't move. It just stood there, frozen, its thin frame shivering from either cold or fear. Logan crouched down, careful not to make any sudden movements. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the half-eaten sandwich he had planned to finish when he got home. "You hungry?" he asked, tearing off a small piece and placing it on the ground in front of him. The dog's nose twitched. It hesitated for a long moment before inching forward, eyes flicking between Logan's face and the food. Then, with a swift movement, it snatched the piece and retreated, chewing quickly, as if afraid someone might take it away. Logan watched as the dog swallowed and licked its lips, its gaze still locked onto him. The hunger in its eyes was unmistakable. He tore off another piece, setting it down just a little closer this time. The dog hesitated again, but the hunger won. It stepped forward, ribs shifting beneath its dirty coat, and took the food. Logan could see it more clearly now: scars, patches of missing fur, a faint limp in its back leg. Someone had failed this dog. He sighed, glancing around. The cold was brutal tonight. This animal wouldn't last much longer out here. "All right," Logan murmured. "What the hell am I supposed to do with you?" The dog just stared at him, ears flicking back against its head. It didn't trust him, not yet, but it also wasn't running away. Logan stood slowly, careful not to startle it. He pulled off his glove and reached out a hand, palm up, giving the dog the choice. It flinched but didn't back away. Its nose twitched again, scenting him. Minutes passed. Then, finally, the dog took a step forward. Its muzzle brushed against his fingertips just for a second before it withdrew. It wasn't much, but it was something. Logan exhaled, rubbing his cold fingers together. "All right, buddy," he muttered. "Let's get you out of here." The dog didn't move as he unzipped his coat and slowly, carefully, draped it over its thin body. It stiffened but didn't bolt. Logan could feel its ribs beneath the fabric, its whole frame trembling from exhaustion and cold. He couldn't leave it here, not like this. So, gently, he crouched again, slipping his arms underneath the dog's frail body. It tensed, a low whimper escaping its throat, but it was too weak to fight. Logan held it close, feeling the rapid heartbeat against his chest, and stood. The dog barely weighed anything. As he carried it toward his truck, snowflakes clung to its fur, melting into the dirt and grime. Whoever had let this happen, whoever had left this dog to starve and freeze Logan, would never understand. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, he just had to get it warm. Logan eased the truck door shut, careful not to jostle the dog too much as he settled it onto the folded blanket on the passenger seat. The heater blasted warm air, cutting through the cold that clung to its thin frame. The dog curled into itself, eyes half-lidded but still wary, its breathing shallow and uneven. The drive home was quiet except for the occasional shuddering breath from the dog and the steady hum of the engine. Logan kept glancing over, watching the rise and fall of its chest, the way its ears twitched at every small sound. It was exhausted, but not fully asleep. Pulling into his driveway, he cut the engine and sat there for a second, rubbing a hand over his face. His house was small, tucked at the edge of town, more space than he really needed. He hadn't planned on sharing it, certainly not with a half-starved, skittish animal that looked like it had been running from something for a long time. He exhaled and opened the door. The dog stirred as the cold air rushed in, lifting its head just slightly. Its dark eyes flicked to him, tense and watchful again. "Come on, let's get you inside," Logan murmured. He grabbed the blanket and lifted the dog again, its body stiffening slightly in his arms, but it didn't struggle. It was too weak for that. Pushing the front door open with his shoulder, he stepped into the warmth of his home, kicking the door shut behind him. The dog barely reacted, just blinking in the dim light of the living room. Logan lowered it onto the couch, unfolding the blanket over it. The weight of warmth made the dog sigh a slow, weary sound. He crouched beside it, studying the tangle of fur and bone in front of him. Up close, he could see the raw patches on its legs, the way its paws were cracked and sore. Dried blood clung to one of them, likely from running too hard on rough pavement. "You've been through it, haven't you?" he muttered. The dog didn't answer, of course, but its gaze softened just slightly, the tension in its frame easing by a fraction. Logan stood, stretching out the stiffness in his shoulders. He had no dog food in the house, but figured something bland would be better than nothing. In the kitchen, he grabbed a bowl and filled it with warm water, then found some plain boiled chicken leftover from the night before. He shredded it into small pieces, carrying both back to the living room. The dog lifted its head when he set the bowl down. Its nose twitched, but it hesitated. Logan backed off, lowering himself into a chair a few feet away. Minutes passed before the dog moved. Slowly, cautiously, it stretched its neck forward, sniffing the chicken before taking a tentative bite. Then another. Logan watched as it ate, its chewing slow and deliberate, as if it wasn't used to having food it didn't have to fight for. "You're safe now," he said quietly. The dog didn't look at him, but it didn't flinch at his voice either. Another small step. After it finished eating, it licked at the water, then rested its head on the edge of the couch, eyes fluttering shut. Logan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing at the knot forming in his neck. He had no idea what he was doing. No plan. He had just brought this dog into his home without thinking past the next step. But looking at it now, curled into the blanket, breathing a little steadier than before, he figured he'd made the right call. For tonight, that was enough. Logan woke to the sound of soft, uneven breathing. Blinking against the dim morning light filtering through the curtains, he turned his head toward the couch. The dog was still there, curled into the blanket, but its eyes were open, watching him. Its ears twitched slightly when he moved, though it didn't lift its head. At some point in the night, it had shifted position, stretching out more than before. The stiffness in its posture had eased just slightly, enough to tell Logan that exhaustion had finally won over fear. He sat up slowly, his muscles protesting after a night of sleeping in the chair. He hadn't planned to stay there, but he hadn't wanted to leave the dog alone either. Now, as he stood and stretched, he glanced toward the kitchen. Food, that needed to be the next step. The dog's eyes followed him as he walked past, but it didn't move. Logan figured it was still recovering from whatever had happened to it before last night. He had no idea how long it had been out there, surviving on scraps, but judging by the way its ribs showed beneath its fur, it had been too long. Digging through his fridge, he found more chicken and set a pot of rice to cook. something easy on the stomach. He wasn't sure what a starving dog could handle, but he knew enough to take it slow. As he worked, the quiet in the house felt different. Less empty, he wasn't sure what to make of that. When the food was ready, he scooped some into a bowl and set it down near the couch, backing away to give the dog space. It lifted its head slightly, sniffing the air. Logan sat at the table, giving it time. He made himself some coffee but didn't drink it, too focused on watching the dog out of the corner of his eye. After a few minutes, it shifted, pushing itself up onto shaky legs. It hesitated, then stepped cautiously toward the bowl. Logan kept still, letting it eat without interruption. He noticed the way it chewed slowly, as if unused to having enough food to take its time. When it finished, it licked its lips, then looked toward him. Not quite trust, not yet, but something less guarded than before. Logan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Guess we need to figure out what happens next," he muttered. The dog didn't react, just stood there watching him. A vet, that had to be the next move. Whatever injuries or illnesses it had, they needed to be dealt with. Logan wasn't about to bring an animal into his home only to let it suffer in silence. He grabbed his phone and found the number for the clinic across town. He had only been there once, years ago, for a friend's dog, but it was the only place he knew. After a short conversation, he had an appointment set for the afternoon. Now came the harder part, getting the dog there. He stood, moving carefully, knowing sudden motion could set it on edge. It tensed slightly, but when he knelt and held out his hand, it didn't back away. "I need to take you to get checked out," he said, his voice even. "It won't be fun, but it's gotta happen." The dog blinked at him. Logan sighed. "Yeah, I know, you don't understand a damn word I'm saying." Still, he moved slowly, reaching for the blanket to wrap it around the dog's thin frame. It flinched but didn't pull away. He lifted it carefully, feeling the way its body stiffened at first before gradually settling against him. The drive to the vet was quiet. The dog sat in the passenger seat, its body pressed against the door, but it didn't try to escape. Just watched him with wary eyes, ears flicking at every noise outside. When they arrived, Logan hesitated before opening the door. "This is gonna suck," he said, more to himself than to the dog, "but it's for the best." Inside, the clinic smelled like antiseptic and fur. The receptionist barely glanced up before doing a double take at the sight of the dog. "Walk in," she asked, pulling up the schedule. "Had an appointment," Logan said, giving his name. She nodded, typing something, then gestured toward the waiting area. The dog stayed close to his legs as they sat, its body tense but still. A few other people were there with their pets, but Logan kept his focus on the dog, watching for any signs of panic. When they were called back, the vet, a woman in her 40s with a calm, practiced air, gave Logan a quick glance before zeroing in on the dog. "Found him like this?" she asked, already assessing its condition with sharp eyes. "Yes, behind a grocery store. Looked like he'd been out there a while." She nodded, kneeling to get a better look. The dog shrank back slightly but didn't snap or growl. "Malnourished," she murmured, running her hand gently over its side. "Dehydrated, some old injuries but nothing fresh, no microchip." Logan felt something settle in his chest at that. No one was looking for this dog. The exam continued in quiet efficiency. The dog endured it without much protest, though its muscles remained tense the entire time. Blood tests, a check on its paws, a look at its teeth. Logan stood by, watching, hands clenched into fists at his sides. When it was done, the vet straightened. "He's in rough shape, but he'll recover," she said. "It's gonna take time. Proper food, rest, maybe some medication for the infections in his paws, but he's lucky you found him when you did." Logan exhaled, nodding. "Any idea how old he is?" She studied the dog for a moment. Hard to say exactly, maybe 3 or 4 years, still young but not a puppy. Logan looked down at the dog, who was watching him again with those tired, uncertain eyes. 3 or 4 years, however long it had been since someone last cared about him. The vet handed over a list of medications and care instructions. He took them without a word, his mind already shifting to what came next. As they left the clinic, the dog hesitated at the door, glancing back once before following Logan out. He wasn't sure why, but that small movement settled something in his chest. Back in the truck, he glanced over as the dog curled into the seat, its body no longer pressed quite so firmly against the door. "Guess I can't keep calling you dog," Logan muttered. The name came without much thought, slipping out before he could second-guess it. "Axel." The dog didn't react, but Logan nodded to himself. "Yeah, that fits." The drive home from the vet was quiet. Logan kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on his knee, stealing occasional glances at the dog at Axel. The name still felt new, still felt like something untested, but it fit in a way Logan couldn't quite explain. Axel lay curled in the passenger seat, his head resting against the worn fabric, eyes half-lidded. Whether from exhaustion or the lingering stress of the vet visit, Logan wasn't sure. The house was just as they'd left it, but something about stepping through the front door felt different now. Logan nudged the door shut with his foot, setting down the bag of medications and care instructions the vet had given him. Axel hesitated in the doorway, sniffing lightly at the air, his ears flicking forward as if testing the space again. Logan let him take his time. He moved to the kitchen, pulling a bottle of water from the fridge and taking a long drink. His mind was already running through the list of things the vet had said: small meals, hydration, antibiotics for the infection in Axel's paws, patience. A lot of patience. Axel finally stepped inside, his gait slow but more deliberate than before. His paws barely made a sound against the hardwood floor as he moved past the couch, pausing near the window. He stood there, still, his head slightly lowered, staring at something beyond the glass. Logan followed his gaze. Outside, the late afternoon sky had turned pale, the neighborhood quiet, nothing unusual. And yet, Axel remained tense, his body rigid in a way that made Logan frown. He set his bottle down. "You waiting for someone?" The words came out softer than he intended. Axel didn't react immediately, but after a moment, he turned his head slightly, just enough to look at Logan from the corner of his eye. There was something in that look, something Logan couldn't quite place, but before he could think too much about it, Axel shifted his weight and moved away from the window, settling cautiously onto the floor near the couch. Logan exhaled, rubbing at his jaw. The silence stretched between them, comfortable in some ways, heavy in others. Eventually, Logan pushed off the counter and grabbed the bag from the vet, sifting through the contents. Pills, ointments, instructions scribbled in the vet's neat handwriting. He crouched near the couch, glancing at Axel, who watched him warily. "All right, buddy, gotta get these in you." Axel's ears twitched, but he made no move to pull away as Logan carefully reached for one of his injured paws. The skin around the cracks was raw, the pads rough and uneven from too much time spent on unforgiving pavement. Logan worked quickly, applying the ointment with slow, deliberate movements. Axel didn't flinch, but he was watching Logan closely, his breathing steady but alert. "Not so bad, right?" Logan muttered, more to himself than anything. The real challenge came when it was time for the antibiotics. Logan grabbed one of the pills, breaking it in half as the vet had instructed, mixing it with a small bite of chicken. He held it out, waiting. Axel sniffed at the food, hesitating. Logan stayed patient, his hand steady. Minutes passed before Axel finally took the offering, chewing slowly. Logan watched, waiting to see if he'd spit it out, but Axel swallowed without protest. "Good dog, The words slipped out before Logan could stop them. Axel froze. Logan did too, realizing immediately that something was wrong. It was subtle the way Axel's ears pressed back, the slight tension that returned to his frame. Not fear, exactly. Something else. Logan frowned. Did someone call you that before? The question was quiet, careful. Axel didn't answer, of course. But he also didn't move, his gaze locked onto Logan's like he was waiting for something. Logan exhaled through his nose, leaning back slightly. All right, he said, shifting the subject. You're set for now, just need to take it easy. He stood, stretching out the stiffness in his back. Axel watched him move, his posture still tense but not as rigid as before. The rest of the evening passed in relative quiet. Logan kept busy, cleaning up the kitchen, checking emails, keeping an eye on Axel without making it obvious. The dog remained near the couch, alert but unmoving, his breathing evening out as exhaustion settled over him again. By the time the clock neared midnight, Logan knew he should sleep, but something kept him rooted in place. Axel hadn't fully relaxed, not yet. He was resting, but his ears flicked at every small noise, his body still coiled in a way that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced this place was safe. Logan sat in the chair across from the couch, rubbing at his temple. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, just watching the slow rise and fall of Axel's chest. Eventually, the dog shifted, his paws stretching slightly against the blanket beneath him. His head turned, eyes barely slitted open, and for the first time since Logan had brought him inside, Axel didn't look wary. He just looked tired. Logan exhaled, leaning back. They'd figure it out, one step at a time. The morning air was crisp, the light filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Logan rubbed the sleep from his eyes as he moved toward the kitchen, his footsteps quiet. He had expected to wake up to the sound of Axel shifting around or pacing near the door, but the house was still, peaceful. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, he finally spotted Axel near the couch, stretched out on his side. His breathing was slow and steady, his body relaxed in a way Logan hadn't seen before. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was trust. The tension that had clung to the dog like a second skin was finally starting to fade. Logan sat at the table, sipping his coffee as he watched Axel sleep. He had been in bad shape when Logan found him, but after a few weeks of steady meals, vet care, and a warm place to rest, the change was undeniable. His coat, though still rough in some areas, had regained some of its former sheen. His ribs weren't as pronounced, his frame filling out with the weight of proper nutrition. More than that, his eyes had changed. The first time Logan had looked into them, they had been hollow, wary, guarded, waiting for whatever cruelty the world had in store next. Now there was something else there, something softer. Axel stirred, his ears twitching as he stretched out his front legs. His eyes blinked open, drowsy but alert, and when they landed on Logan, he didn't tense. Logan smirked, morning lazy. Axel let out a long breath through his nose, then pushed himself onto his paws, shaking out his thickening coat. He padded toward Logan with slow, even steps, his gaze steady. Logan reached for the bag of kibble he had picked up a few days ago and poured some into a bowl. Axel didn't hesitate this time, he walked straight over and started eating. Seeing him eat without hesitation was a relief. The first few days had been rough, with Axel refusing food unless it was hand-fed or mixed with chicken. But now, he trusted that there would always be another meal. Logan leaned back in his chair, watching him. "You're getting comfortable, huh?" Axel didn't lift his head, but his tail gave a slow, deliberate wag. After breakfast, Logan grabbed his jacket and boots. It had been weeks since Axel had come home with him, but Logan had been careful about exposing him to too much too soon. Now, though, he figured it was time to see how Axel handled being outside on a leash. When he reached for it, Axel's ears perked slightly, his eyes scanning Logan's movements. Logan crouched in front of him, holding the leash out for him to sniff. "No pressure," Logan said quietly, keeping his movements slow. "We'll go at your pace." Axel hesitated, his nose twitching as he took in the scent of the leather. Then, with a careful step forward, he allowed Logan to clip it onto his collar. Logan stood, giving a gentle tug. "Come on, let's see how you do." The first few steps outside were cautious. Axel's head stayed low, his eyes scanning the yard carefully. Logan kept the leash loose, letting him take his time. They walked down the driveway, then onto the sidewalk, the cool morning air stirring Axel's fur. At first, Axel kept close to Logan's leg, his body coiled with tension. But as they walked, his steps grew more confident. He sniffed at a patch of grass, his ears flicking forward as if rediscovering the world outside. Logan let him take the lead within reason. They walked for a few blocks, the quiet neighborhood providing a safe environment for Axel's first real outing. He didn't flinch at passing cars, didn't tuck his tail at the sight of distant pedestrians. When they reached a small park, Logan slowed, watching Axel for any sign of distress. But instead of pulling away, Axel sat beside him, his head tilted slightly as he watched a squirrel dart up a tree. Logan huffed a quiet laugh. "You thinking about chasing it?" Axel gave him a sideways look, then exhaled, his body finally settling into a relaxed stance. That was when Logan knew. This wasn't temporary. Axel wasn't just some stray he had picked up out of pity. He wasn't a project or an obligation. He was home. Logan reached down, running a slow hand over Axel's back. The dog leaned into the touch, just for a second, before shifting his weight and gazing up at Logan with something that looked an awful lot like understanding. Logan nodded. "Yeah, buddy, you're staying." Axel didn't react with excitement, no jumping, no tail wagging frenzy. Just a quiet acceptance, as if he had already made the same decision long before Logan had put it into words. They walked back home at an easy pace, Axel's steps lighter than before. When they reached the house, Logan unclipped the leash, and Axel padded inside without hesitation. For the first time, Logan didn't feel like his house was too empty. It felt right. Axel curled up near the couch, resting his head on his paws. Logan sat beside him, scratching lightly behind his ears. Neither of them said anything, not that words were needed. They had both found what they were looking for. Logan stood by the truck, adjusting the bags in his hands as he nudged the door shut with his hip. The grocery run had been quick, just enough to restock what he and Axel needed for the week. He glanced toward the house, where Axel sat near the window, ears perked as he watched Logan's every move. It was a small thing, but Logan noticed Axel always kept track of him. Whether inside or out, the dog's gaze followed, not in fear but in something steadier, something that had settled between them over the past few weeks. Logan stepped inside, setting the bags on the counter. Axel padded over, sniffing at the contents before sitting back on his haunches, waiting. Logan pulled out a package of fresh meat, setting some aside before grabbing a bowl. Axel ate with measured bites now, no longer inhaling his food like it might disappear. His frame had filled out, muscle replacing the thinness that had once made him look fragile. The scars were still there, some wounds too deep to ever fully fade, but they no longer defined him. Logan leaned against the counter, watching the steady rhythm of Axel's breathing as he ate. The past few weeks had been a test of patience. The first time Logan had left him alone, even for a short time, Axel had been uneasy. Not destructive, not panicked, but alert in a way that suggested he wasn't sure if Logan was coming back. Now, the tension had eased. Logan could leave for a few hours and return to find Axel waiting, calm, ears flicking forward in recognition rather than worry. Logan grabbed his jacket, checking the time. The sun was still high enough for a decent walk before the evening chill set in. He held up the leash, and Axel's ears twitched before he made his way over, sitting still as Logan clipped it on. They stepped outside, the cool air carrying the scent of damp earth from last night's rain. The neighborhood was quiet, the occasional car passing by, the distant sound of a child's laughter from a nearby yard. Axel walked with steady strides, his head level, tail relaxed. They headed toward the wooded trail at the edge of town, a place Logan had been meaning to take Axel once he was ready. The path was worn but familiar, lined with tall pines that swayed gently in the breeze. Logan let Axel set the pace, watching as he took in the new scents, his nose working over fallen leaves and damp soil. A rustle in the brush caught Axel's attention. His body tensed, muscles coiling as a rabbit darted across the path. For a brief moment, Logan felt the energy shift, the instinct to chase flickering in Axel's stance. But then, just as quickly, he let it pass, exhaling before continuing forward. Logan gave a small nod of approval. The restraint was new. A few weeks ago, Axel wouldn't have hesitated. They walked deeper into the trail, the sounds of town fading behind them. Logan liked it out here, the quiet, the solitude. It was part of why he had moved to this town in the first place. He had needed space, time to figure things out. Axel stuck close, his ears flicking occasionally at distant sounds. Logan could tell he liked it here too. The open air, the freedom of movement, the lack of walls. Even though he stayed near Logan, there was something looser about him out here, something that made Logan think this was closer to what Axel had been before whatever had happened to him. They reached a clearing where the trees broke apart, revealing a small stretch of rocky terrain overlooking the valley below. Logan crouched, resting his arms on his knees as he took in the view. Axel sat beside him, his gaze following Logan's. The town stretched out in the distance, the rooftops clustered together, the faint glimmer of the river just beyond. Logan exhaled. He didn't talk much, hadn't ever been the type to fill silence with unnecessary words. But standing here with Axel beside him, he didn't feel the need to say anything, because Axel understood. They stayed there for a while, letting the wind move around them, letting the world settle. Eventually, Logan gave a small pat to Axel's side before standing. The dog followed suit, shaking out his coat before they turned back toward the trail. By the time they reached home, the sky had started its slow shift toward dusk. Logan unclipped the leash, and Axel padded inside without hesitation, moving to his usual spot near the couch. Logan set his jacket aside, stretching out the stiffness in his shoulders. He caught Axel watching him from the corner of his eye, his gaze steady. Logan smirked. "What?" Axel didn't move, didn't look away. Logan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I know." He didn't need to say it out loud. He hadn't just rescued Axel. Axel had rescued him too,